Hi, and welcome to this episode of Take Up and Read. My name is Joe Chrisman. I'm your host, and I'm joined by Chris Weniger, my best friend. Today, our special guest is Douglas O'Donnell. He is the Senior Vice President for Bible Editorial over at Crossway Publications. We love Crossway. They're good friends, and Doug is a very good friend of Chris and I's over the years, and we were just catching up on some of our old stories. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, great to be with you. I'm sad that Chris gets the best friend designation. I feel a little bit left out there, but
There's room to
one of your friends is good.
yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to sell myself too highly, Doug. I don't want people out there thinking I'm closer than I really am. So,
Right.
but no, there's always room to add another best friend.
There you go.
Yeah. So, Doug, it's really good to be with you here today. We're going to start off, if I'm correct, Chris. We want to start off talking about kind of some of your more recent projects before we jump into what I'm just excited to chat about is commentaries. But Chris, I think you have a question for him first to start off about his new devotional that just came out.
Yeah, so we do want to spend most of our time talking about commentaries, commentary writing, and all the commentaries you've done. But your most recent project, as far as we're aware, is not a commentary. It's this book that Joe's lifting up, Daily Liturgy Devotional. So I just want to start there, and would love just to hear a little bit about what is this book? How did it come about? Why'd you write this? And what are your hopes for this book?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The impetus for it, at least the initial impetus, was a good friend of mine who was sort of struggling devotionally with what do I, and this is a mature Christian guy who is just kind of going through a dry season. I don't even know where to start, with prayer. And I said, well, what I often do is I pray the Gloria Patri, I pray the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, I pray the Lord's Prayer, and that's usually how I just start things out. And it kind of got me the idea of it might be a really helpful resource for someone to have some set prayers that would get them going during the day, or just be as their devotion. And so that was sort of the start of it. The more I got into it, the more it became a project for myself, and almost I need this. I think I need. I'm a very structured person, but I need more structure in my prayer life that would help me know what to pray next. It's the disciples say, Lord, teach us how to pray, and I still feel, even at my age and my experience, I still ask that question, teach me how to pray. And so this was creating a resource for myself, for my friend, and then I also had in mind really the new Christian who is asking that same question, how do Christians pray? And I wanted to give examples from great Christian prayers from the Bible, like the Lord's Prayer, like Psalm 23, things that would be good starting places, but also you never get past those prayers. They're so beautiful. So that was kind of the impetus for it. I think I wanted to design something that had some thoughtful pedagogy, how you learn, how you teach things. And so that's where the idea of 40 days. I'm a very, I get in good habits and bad habits. And, and when I get a good habit, I tend to do the same thing, day after day after day. And so it's if you could pray these prayers for 40 days, you'll get in a really good habit. And then I've divided the book on 8 really important topics. So if I had to pick these are the 8, they're not systematic theology topics, although they could be like that, but the gospel's the first one. So it's 5 days, 8 topics, 5 days each, 40 days is the structure of it. So by the time you get through those 5 days of the gospel, I've picked what I think are the 5 best gospel passages. And then I've added a little commentary on it. And so the pedagogy behind that is if you don't know anything about the gospel, I'm going to teach you what the gospel is in 5 short passages, commentary, which are more just reflections on it. And then everything in that chapter is going to reinforce that theme of the gospel. So and this is also the pedagogy of how it's designed uses the acronym ACTS, which is developed by Origen of Alexandria way back in the days, which has just been a thing that Christians use all the time: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. it's not as often as you'd think used in actual prayer books. And so that's how I structured it, to say this is a really good way to pray every day. And then I give you prayers to pray that are short and sweet, that are sample prayers, or that's your prayer for the day. And they've always got sort of prayer prompts too, so you can continue to pray. So here's a Psalm of Thanksgiving, but then what else are you thankful for? And so you can do it, in the 10-minute version or the 10-hour version if you want to, as long as you want to keep thinking about things you're thankful for and how great God is and all those sort of things. Something else somewhat unique is I've got 40 hymns, classic hymns. So at the end of each lesson or day, there's a hymn. And again, this goes back to sort of what I want to teach people. A lot of Christians, a lot of Reformed people, don't go to churches that sing hymns anymore. And so, especially if that's where they're at, I wanted them to know. I think of my own children. Sometimes I'm like, I just assume they know these 40 hymns, and they don't. And so we've been using it around the table when everyone's home, and just like I read one of the devotions or one of the prayers, excuse me, and then we sing the hymn together. And I say, if you don't know how it sounds like, I'm going to hum the tune, I'm going to sing it, and then it's got a little musical notation, which is, yeah. So it helps you if you read music to know, oh yeah, it's that tune, he's got it too. If you don't read music, it just looks cool. But I wanted to introduce Christians, to, these are like what I think are the 40 songs that every Christian should know. Know by heart, great if you keep using the book over and over, but at least know pretty well. And then there are plenty of original prayers, but I've also got classic prayers in there. And this is both to like introduce people to figures in church history, a Calvin, an Edwards, an Augustine, Aquinas. But also I'm trying to be as diverse as possible with the ages of church history. And so, from the earliest church to a John Stott or something. And that sort of breadth to show you're part of, as you pray, you're part of something, you're part of the communion of saints, you're part of the Catholic Church, the universal church. And so I think all those features put together kind of make it a distinct product out there, and hopefully something that people will find really helpful and beneficial. And as Joe showed the book, I mean, Crossway does an amazing job of designing it, and it's just the right size too. I feel like it doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels like something you carry with your Bible, go in the coffee shop and read your Bible and pray your prayers. So anyway, that's there was one other part of your question that I'm forgetting now, but what I hoped for it or something like that.
Yeah. What are your hopes for the book?
Answer a little. Yeah, I think I told my wife, since I've done so many commentaries, I'm like, oh, this is a book that might actually sell, People might actually, like, there's a lot of Christians out there and they all should be praying. So there's a real market for this, which, compared to a commentary on Ecclesiastes or the Song of Songs or something like that, Job, there's a little bit narrower market. And I've never written to make money or have a book being a bestseller, but this is, I'm glad to actually move into this. I had been working on like children's curriculum, children's Bible stuff that like people will use. But this was my own book where I felt like this is something at the popular level that for the populace of the Christian church can be really helpful, or one of the helpful resources out there. So my hope is that, Christians would use it and delight in it and use it again and again.
That's great.
I couldn't agree with you more, Doug. I mean, so just looking at just one selection, I mean, one of these entries is 4.5 pages, very accessible. I mean, as you said, you can sit and meditate and be with it as long as you want, but they're very accessible. The entries, I'll show this just to kind of give a feel for the format of how all of the prayers that are in here are shorter. I do really appreciate that you have historic prayers and you cite where it's coming from, whether it's a prayer by Richard Baxter or the Book of Common Prayer or whatever it may be. And I love the hymns may be my favorite part of the book. The fact that you included those hymns. Now I'm biased in the fact that I agree with you in terms of the 40 hymns you chose are excellent.
Good.
But I think this book is excellent. And I have, for much of my ministry, people will come and say, "Can you give me a devotional?" And what they really are asking for is the kind of standard, you would find in a Christian bookstore where it's here's one verse and one page entry commentary text on it, and those aren't necessarily wrong to use, but I don't find many of them that are very helpful or very balanced or substantive. And now I feel like there's a devotional that, like you said, it's slim in the hand, it's easy to hold, it's easy to take with you in a bag, and you can read it. You could realistically read this, engage with over a lunch break or something like that. And I think this is just a tremendous book. So I just want to say thanks for writing it.
Yeah, and thanks, I appreciate, you talked about kind of pedagogical method behind the book as well. And that's one of the things I also really appreciate about it, Doug, that it's not just, okay, read this prayer, which is great, but it's also now, in light of this prayer, you pray for these things. And so it's also teaching how to pray. And it's not just now read these verses, but read these verses. Now here are some thoughts on these verses. And so I really appreciate that. I was actually just a couple of weeks ago talking to some church planters out here who were saying that they're finding right now just a real deep hunger for a discipleship and a way to grow spiritually that is more historically rooted, where it's not just, let me sit down and pray, or it's like, I don't feel like praying, so why should I sit down and pray? Or you sit down and pray and it's just whatever kind of comes to my mind. And there's not that there's anything wrong with that at all, but there's just more of they were telling me that they're seeing much more of a desire for something that's more, we're so individualistic. Get me out of myself. Because you were talking about, you're in the communion of the saints throughout all history. And so it's great to see this book and how it seems like a great tool to grow in faith that really gets us out of ourselves, that really doesn't just give us what to pray, but also teaches us how. So some really cool things you did with this book. I am curious, Doug, because it's 40 entries on, like you were saying, 8 specific topics, by no means exhaustive. So are there any thoughts of writing more volumes that are going to touch on more topics or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely could. I mean, I think the way the book is structured, could lend to that format. I'm actually, and this is not public. I guess it is public since you're recording, but I'm working on even a more simple devotional book that I'm writing something that Crossways asked me to write, because we've got this Million Bible campaign where we're giving away 1 million Bibles to people who've never had a Bible before in Africa and places that someone might not have the resources to have a Bible. And I've been asked to write just 20,000. And Joe, you've talked to me about this with my genre book, like how to read the Bible.
Yep.
Like what would I say? And so that's got me thinking about that person in particular. Like, can I also create a prayer book for them that would be not liturgical in the same way that might be off-putting, but just like a little prayer book that would be thoughtful in the same way that this one was thoughtful in how I structure it, but just even have a little bit more simplicity in page count and in the type of prayers I use. So less classic prayers. A lot of the classical prayers I've chosen I just think are beautiful, the language that's used and the cadence and all of that. But mostly this would be like my own prayers that are shorter and more contemporary for someone who's just starting, first time they're ever reading a Bible, first time they're ever praying. So, but I could do both. But I think that's the one more on my heart right now, is to do a sort of a simplified version of it.
Is there any estimate as to when that might be available? I know it's not, and we can edit all this out if you want us to. But.
Yeah, I'm going to propose it soon, and so if Crossway says yes, then it's almost all written, which is not how I usually do books, but it was kind of over Christmas break. I had inspiration to do it and kind of knocked it out. So it early would be like in the fall.
Yeah.
that would be very quick. But there wouldn't be much editorial. It's not a lot of words, and so anyway,
We'll keep an eye out for it. Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe
There,
like, you remember how?
there,
What's up?
sorry, there is something to Chris's question, I guess. If somebody like really likes this prayer book, like what's the next prayer book, you know? So it's nice to have it come out a year later, or at least 2 years later, you know?
Yep. Well, and who knows? Maybe like D.A. Carson has his For the Love of God devotional, which is excellent. Goes through the Murray Machine plan. He has 2 volumes. In that, maybe we'll just slowly start adding.
There you go.
And the color of the book can be just slightly different, so it's a beautiful set. Crosswell, no doubt. Crosswell crushed the publishing side of it. Okay, I want to move to commentaries because that's what I most want to talk about selfishly. So, Doug, I want to structure this in 2 categories. The first is just writing a commentary in general, and then second is talking about your specific commentaries that you have written. I've got a couple here that I want to ask some specific questions on. But in terms of writing a commentary, I'm just curious, like writing a book to me, okay, I can get my head around the process of you've got a theme, you've got a topic, you're collecting information you've been reading on, you're studying, whatever it may be. You sit down to write a cohesive thought and you're elaborating for each chapter and building this argument throughout the entire book. Writing a commentary feels just like a Mount Everest kind of thing to me, of being able to not only engage the text well enough that you say, okay, I'm going to put this down, have it be an aid to other people, but on top of that, engaging what else has been written technically on the book. So I'm just curious, what does the process look like? You've written so many commentaries at this point. Like, what does it look like for you to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a commentary on Matthew or Job or something like that?
Yeah, I can give you sort of my general process, and it may be different depending on what sort of genre of commentary it is, but maybe a sort of step back. I think one of the things God has gifted me with is I'm a plower. So I'm not the fastest reader. I'm not the fastest writer. I'm pretty fast, but not the fastest. And but I just keep going every day. And so I used to work as an overnight security guard, and the guy who worked with me, one of the guys who worked with me, was son of a farmer from Iowa, and he would see me reading Edwards or Calvin, and over the years see like, you read the whole Institute, like, and I said, well, I just read a little bit every day, and so it didn't seem like it just was plowing the field for that day, you know. And so he called me a plower. He's like, you're like my dad. You just kind of, it doesn't seem like you're doing much, but 4 years later, you've got this beautiful field, you know? So I think my temperament is that way, where I'm a very consistent, disciplined person. And so a commentary sort of takes that sort of temperament to be like, I can just do a little bit every day and be content with that. And then by the end, whether it's 1 year or 4 years or longer, I'll have a finished product. So that's sort of stepping back from sort of the whole process and a little bit about who I am. I'd say that's probably typical of guys who write the massive commentaries on, you know, the most technical commentaries that take 10, 20 years to write. They may even be much better plowers than I am. But so my process is not always the same, but there are some similarities, I'd say, like, and one of the things, I haven't always done this, but this is something I've done recently, is like, and this actually comes from a Greek professor I had, John McCabe at Wheaton College. When he was later in his life, he obviously was brilliant at Greek. He, or maybe he did this most of his life, but he would always listen to the English and read along in his Greek. And he would just do that every day just to keep fresh and kind of, and so I've done that practice the last 5 years or so. And I listen to the ESV app on slow. And so I just kind of, so I'm doing a commentary on Luke next. So I'm just slowly I read through a chapter a day. So I'm not getting stopped by like, I don't know what that word is, I'm looking this up, you know. I'm just looking at the Greek and getting the book in my head. So, and then I'm not doing a technical commentary. So I just want a sense of what the Greek is. How hard is it? How much do I need to kind of invest in it? I'm writing little notes like, oh, I didn't know that that's the word that's actually used here because it's used right here too. And I'm not doing extensive notes, but I'm just by looking at the Greek. So I'm not doing anything like I know, guys who it's like I translate every word and all, even for sermons and things like that. And that's never been me. And I've always struggled with languages. I know how to use languages, but I'm not a whiz with languages. And so this just gets me in the language without it being too intimidating. And I'm able to see, because I know words well enough, I know structure well enough that some of the things I should be seeing, in the Greek text. Um, and then a similar sort of thing. So I'm just getting the book in my head. And then I read through it. I do a lot more listening now in my 50s than I used to, but and I've got a long commute. So I'll listen to the book over and over. I will read through the book over and over. I always print it out, and I just kind of work through it. And so I get it sort of out of my Bible, and that way I can color code. I can do different underlinings, and I kind of have a system of how that all works. But by the end of like reading and rereading over and over the book, I've got this sort of, here's Luke, and it's like it's all marked up, and I'm trying by the end of that to create an outline of here are the divides. Here's how I'm going to tackle this major project. And so I've got, let's say Matthew was almost like 89 divisions. I decided to break it up. And so then I start, if I'm able, I'll try to preach through it. So that way I'm having to do sort of the task of how I want everything to be relatable to people. And so how I structure it matters, and doing a homiletical outline just helps you with that. Doing illustrations helps you with that. How will people hear this? But I think the same is true for writing a commentary. Like I want this to be interesting to people, as interesting as a sermon would be, whether I'm doing a homiletical commentary or not or some other kind of commentary. So if I'm able, I'll preach. So like right now, if someone says, "Hey, Doug, will you come and preach?" I'm like, "Yeah, if it's Luke." So I'm not going to jump in a series. I want to preach. There'll be exceptions to that, but because I want to write this commentary on Luke, and so I'm always thinking, how is this going to serve the local church? And the best way for me to know that is actually preach it to a local church and get a sense of like, oh, that really worked, that didn't work, type of thing, either about how I structure it, the outline, or some of the applications, some of the illustrations I've used. That's not always the case. Sometimes and it depends on different books. For example, the book of Job, I did a commentary for the ESV EC commentary. I preached a little bit on Job, but not extensively. And then I just finished a commentary for the Reformed Expository commentary series, and I wrote the commentary first, and now I'm preaching it. So that's a little bit back. I've never done that before, but with Job, I thought there's too many technical things that I don't want in the sermon, but I do want in the commentary.
Right.
And so I wanted to write it first. But preaching's involved, I guess, is my and somewhere in the steps of it all, whether it's usually before or after the fact. And then I read widely on the book. So I typically don't read, if it's like, I'll just put, here's the difference. Like I've done a lot in wisdom literature and gospels. My PhD is in the Gospel of Matthew. So I don't tend to read introductions to the Gospels. I just find it a little tedious and boring. But when I get to Song of Solomon, I want to read the introduction because I might not know what I'm getting into or talking about. And so Ecclesiastes would be the same way. Like, what help me get my head in this book, because it's a little bit trickier than jumping into Matthew. So it depends kind of what your own background is, but that's where I feel weak, I go to the commentary introductions and I read them pretty thoroughly. Where I feel strong, I just depend on my own work, and then I'll use the commentary as I go, but won't kind of go back to the introduction for anything. And then, so I'm reading widely commentaries. I'm reading widely on themes I know are part of the book. So let's take Ecclesiastes and Job. Like I'm preaching through Job. I'm reading books on suffering. I'm reading, Crossley just published The Songs of Suffering by Johnny Erickson Tada. Well, I'm going to read that. Whereas I normally wouldn't be reading that, but I'm like, well, that directly could connect. I could use a quote. I could use an illustration. So I'm always thinking of like what could make it into the commentary that might be of interest. With Ecclesiastes, it's one of my smallest volumes I've ever done. I read so widely, like poetry, a lot of depressing poetry, and I felt like, so I sifted through all of that stuff out there, and I took the best little bits and sprinkled it throughout the commentary. So nobody will know like, oh, that took a lot of work. It just seemed like, oh, he just chose this thing. But it's because I was reading so widely and then being so selective of like, that's the perfect quote here from this novel, from this, play, from this. So I don't do that for every book, but for the wisdom literature, I tend to do that. I also will look at like paintings or other things in the Gospels more than anything. There's so many paintings on the life of Christ, and how does I just preached on the Annunciation, and I was writing commentary on that for Luke, and there's three paintings that are beautiful, like to show three different aspects of Mary's reaction to the Annunciation, and so that's not exegetical work really. That's just sort of observing the history that's out there related to the text. So I'm doing a lot of reading, and as I go, I'm reading lots of commentaries, and through that I'll find who are my favorite commentaries, and I'll keep coming back to them. But I keep sprinkling with the other guys, like I should read him again on this just to see if he's got some insight. So then, Joe, at the talk we had mentioned before we got on air here, like I had just talked about the art of spirit spilled, the Zinsenfleisch, like sitting flesh, and how that's what I'm doing a lot. That's sort of where I'm starting. I'm like looking at the text myself, then I'm looking with commentators at the text and seeing what they see. What I do is I go through commentary and I put these little dots next to it, and then either I do it myself or someone else types it in for me. And I've got all this information. So it'd be like verse 1, and it's got all the quotes from all the commentaries I've read. And then as I'm writing, I've got that on a piece of paper. Most guys your age would have it on a screen, but I probably should do that.
I'm on team paper.
Okay, so it's on a piece of paper, and then I'm just crossing it out if I won't use that, or because I've already finished the section, or I want to add that somewhere. Either like the concept, he's getting at, or that's a quote that's going to go in there. And every time I'm writing, I'm thoroughly documenting it, so I know where I got it from, and I don't have to chase it down when the whole thing is done. And then, what are some other things I'm doing? Back to the plowing thing. I'm trying to write every day, but Sunday, something. I'm trying to get in a rhythm with Luke. So like right now I'm out of a rhythm because I was working on a different project, and my wife and kids are gone this weekend. I'm getting back in the rhythm. And so what that rhythm is for me is I'm always writing 2 times a day. I write in the morning, and then I write right after dinner. And so I've always got 2 hours a day, typically more now that my kids are older. And sometimes at night, I'll just tell my wife, I'm on a roll. I'm just going to keep writing. and that just means I'll work another hour. I don't work. We always go to bed together, 10 o'clock, the latest. Like, so but I'm just doing that every day at those little pockets of time. And so my goal is that by the end of, so let's say I've got 89 sections I want to cover. I want to try and get a section done every 2 weeks. And so then I'm going to be done with this project in however long, it takes. If it's First John, I'll be done pretty soon. It won't take that long. If it's Matthew or Luke, it'll take 3 years, 4 years to do. Job, it will take that long as well. But I'm making progress every day towards it and trying to stick to those goals. I usually have sort of a chart of all those sections and sort of cross off as I get through. And then kind of the next phase is I write everything first. So I'm a quick writer and I can get thoughts down. I never have writer's block because I've always got a text in front of me. So there's always I always got a text, and I always got other commentaries I can read that will trigger thoughts in my brain. I often think of commentaries for me are like, they stir my exegetical imagination. So it could be like that. Oh, that's really interesting. You know what that reminds me of is this thing in Jeremiah, and so it's like, I'm not even borrowing like what they said, but I'm borrowing sort of the world they were in. And that helps me to kind of think of my own commentary and what I need to write. My wife says I'm kind of strange because I love kind of every part of it. And this is why I probably keep writing, is I love like the editorial part. So it's not just the creative part, like, oh, I got all this on paper. But once I'm done writing everything and I've got to meticulously work through it, I like the process of like, well, seeing things that are mistakes. And then also, how can I cut 1,000 words from this chapter? And some people are like, oh, everything I've written is so great. Nothing should go on the editing floor. And I'm just a big believer in editing and how valuable it is. So my own editing, and then a professional, editing it after me, and taking that feedback to heart, saying, I think they know what they're talking about, and this is a clumsy sentence, or this doesn't make sense, or you forgot to do something here. Sometimes I'll invite friends to read it. So like Davis, who Joe works with me. He wanted to read the chapters on this new Job commentary, and so I'd send it to him. And so when you have someone, he's obviously in professional publishing, but I usually I have friends. I've got a former admin secretary who I worked with for years, and she just reads my stuff and gives me great feedback, finds typos, and she's read probably most of my books. So there are people like that, and it just helps me also to know the audience out there. When she's reading it and she's like, I don't know what you're talking about here. I need to clarify it then. And then I enjoy sort of rewriting it after all of the feedback has come in. And then, so that's my process. I know it was a long answer. I guess it's a long process.
That's exactly what we're looking for, though. Our desire with all these conversations is to bring people we really have been blessed by, who are really interesting, and just let them talk. That's our. Well, one thing, Doug, I want to mention just before we move off of writing process into a couple of your commentaries that I have here. Across all of your commentaries that I've read, you made the comment earlier that you want what you write to be relevant, to be helpful, to actually be useful for, presumably pastors are going to be, for most of your commentaries, are going to be the ones primarily engaging with it. What I have been most blessed by your work is you've got that process you just laid out, incredibly substantive, technical, all the deep work you're doing on that. And yet if you read a chapter out of your Matthew commentary or out of Job or Ecclesiastes, what I find just the most helpful is you've taken the time to get those breaks right, and to have even the structure within it be very expositional and organized in that way. I know you've done a lot of work with Simeon Trust. I'm a big fan of Simeon Trust. Being able to look at the legacy of someone like Dick Lucas and see that work. I just see those fingerprints all over the way you do commentaries, and that it really is substantive work, but it's for the preacher and for the pastor. And so I wonder if you could just speak to that just briefly is that something that's in your mind as you're coming up with even the subheadings in a chapter? Are you thinking through like, now, how would I preach this text? I know you said you want to preach it. How much is that governing kind of the final product is going to be?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, ultimately, I'm I am writing for preachers, and if someone, a layperson, wants to pick it up and use it devotionally, I think it could still work. And I'm not writing super technical stuff. There are other great resources out there if you want the, you know, 13 views of what salt is in Matthew 5. That's never interest me. And I think it's just temperament and education. I think so. It's kind of I I yeah, it was greatly influenced by Kent Hughes, Dave Helm, who started Simeon Trust, John Dennis, he's my pastors, Randy Grundyke, all the college church sort of model of expositional preaching, Dick Lucas, and the Jensen brothers down in Australia, other people who were modeling biblical theology and clear exposition, and the use, how do you get to Christ? These sort of things. So that was just sort of the air I breathed, and so I want anything I write to be really applicable to the church, first of all, but commentary wise, like for the pastor. And so that can be, oh, that's a helpful way to start a sermon or something like that. I can use, a story I've got is something like that. And then I do think the what I've used, like John Stott is so great at this, is, and the kind of a model for me is like you you read Stott and you always want to steal his outline because it's just so good. And so I wanted that to be like, hey, this is a really good outline, like, so go ahead and use it or something like it if it's helpful for you. And I'm sure there's times I do that well and times I don't, but I think I've always got that in mind. Like, this is not just here's the next section, here's the next section. It's for the preacher and helping them homiletically
Well,
get to where they need to.
I was telling Chris before you jumped on, Doug. So this is your Matthew commentary, all 1,000+ pages of it. But I mean, for anyone who's read a Matthew, I mean, incredibly engageable. The entries for every chapter are not very long. I mean, it's often 5, 6, 7 pages, give or take.
Yeah.
I'm very big on, if I'm going to use someone's outline, I have to let the congregation know, hey, I'm using something that I have found and was benefited by. I was telling Chris, I have preached one-off sermons so often in Matthew that I've almost preached like a majority of the book. And this is by far my favorite commentary on the book of Matthew. And there have been several of those times where I'm doing my work and it's Friday night. I just can't figure out what's the right, what are the 3 points that I'm going to come away with, or the 4 points, or whatever it may be. And finally, at the very beginning, you say, you know what? I've been richly blessed by Doug O'Donnell as he rightfully identifies, here are the 3 major ideas here, and then go from, I mean, there's so, as you said, you don't want to read Stott. I don't want to read you. I get too late in the process.
That's a high compliment.
Yeah. It's, I just am very blessed that it's incredibly substantive. And I think efficient is the word I'm looking for an expositor, in that the text I'm reading in the commentary, all of it is pertinent to the sermon work that I'm doing. And so while you said there's other commentaries that will go down hallways that are interesting, and someone needs to be writing on it. There needs to be good, faithful men working on it. And yet, if you're pastoring a church, leading a congregation, there's only so much time you have. You need those 2 to 3 guys you can really bank on. And so I've been richly blessed by your work. One commentary I wanted to ask you specifically about, Doug, this new series, the Expository Reflections on the Gospels. So I'm holding Mark, but I know this is going to be a whole set. I wonder if you could just briefly tell us, is this in line of similar to J.C. Ryle's volumes on the Gospels? Tell us a little bit about this newer set.
Yeah, my personal goal before I die is I'd like to write a commentary on all the Old Testament wisdom literature and then the 4 Gospels. And so this was I love that, J.C. Ryle, Calvin did a little something different, but did something on the 4 Gospels. Aquinas did something on the 4 Gospels. Not to lump myself with those 3 giants, but just kind of, I love the idea of like one voice on the 4 Gospels. And so like J.C. Ryle is just like, there's a timeless quality to what he achieved. And so, I wanted that idea of like, I want to write something like Ryle that you can go for, like, I go to him for like application because that's how he does his outlines. And so, that you could get that from it, but it would have a little more meat and depth to it. It's bigger, obviously, but um, and a lot of kind of what's the thing you were saying, Joe. I think how I want to serve the church is I'm going to read all those technical commentaries on this passage, and I'm going to tell you what I think is the most important thing. And if there's 3 views you should know about, I'll put it in there, but rarely will I. I'll just tell you what I think it is. And so that's I'm trying to bridge that sort of gap with this work as well, to add, so there'll be, Riley, he doesn't have footnotes really, just kind of, a little robust academic rigor behind the scenes, but has the same sort of flow of a homiletical commentary and the idea of like just one voice on the 4 gospels. I just think is a cool concept, and if I can pull it off, that'd be great.
I love
we'll see.
I love it. Well, I'm looking forward to the future volume. Like I said, I've been blessed. Your Matthew commentary, Mark, you let me benefit from your work on Job when I was preaching through Job. This is many years ago while I was preaching in the city. And so I feel like everything I've read from you has been just incredibly helpful for preaching. And so thank you. Just keep working. Tell Crossway to have all the time
to leave me alone. Yeah.
to keep writing. I thought it'd be fun, Doug, to play a quick game. We did this. We're trying to do fun little games with our guests. We had Jason Alopoulos on our last episode, and we talked about what book would you recommend for different pastoral kind of situations. For you, I'd like to go through and say, okay, what's your favorite commentary? And I'm going to give you a book, and you can give me 1 or 2 or whatnot. And the qualifier I'll make is you're not saying it's objectively the best commentary that's ever been written. So no one should take offense if you slight them by not picking them. But what would you, if someone's listening to this, maybe it's a pastor, maybe it's a young pastor, he's trying to fill up his library a little bit with best commentaries. What are some of the ones you would point them to for each of these books? So let me start with the book of Mark. Since we just talked about your commentary, Mark, which let me plug your book so you don't have to. This is a commentary. But if you couldn't pick your own, which one would you point to?
Yeah, that's well, I'm glad you asked Mark first and not First, Second Chronicles or something. But yeah, far and away, my favorite was Mark Strauss's work. So, and I've told him that through email, because I know commentators don't often get sort of thank you notes like popular writers. And this is just good blood too. Like he's, on the NIV translation committee. I'm on the ESV, and but I just think he just did the best work. He's got the scholarly chops, and he's such a clear writer, and it did what I was kind of talking. It's academic-y, but it's really helpful for the pastor. So he kind of got to what the pastor would really need. And so I constantly found myself, I read through all of his because I felt like, well, that's sort of the key, is like, if I read through each and every word of someone, this is a really good commentary, because you don't do that very often. So definitely Mark Strauss. I think like classic, wonderful technical commentaries, Edwards and France, are just great, for going for the technical stuff, and so grateful for people like that who can do all that hard work, and that we have so many resources from those 2 guys and other people like them. So those would be the 3 that I would say. I mean, I'd actually like throw J.C. Ryle in there, like if you want something on the more practical side, that would be a helpful one to add.
Great. How about Ephesians?
Whenever I think of Paul, I'm always and they're on the translation oversight committee, so I am biased, but it's even before I worked with them personally. Frank Thielman, I don't know if he's done, what book did you say?
Ephesians.
Yeah, he's done one. And Clint Arnold are 2 guys. Them and Yarborough and Schreiner, like I've always found anything they've written are just always so excellent. But yeah, in Paul, and I think that's they've both written on that book, I believe.
Yep. Okay, so then let's go wisdom literature. So, what is some of the most helpful resources on Job that you've read?
Yeah,
Is it massive set? I'm
say
trying to
that
remember
again.
Carol's, the Westminster Divine, the classic. I can't remember how many volumes it is in that set.
Oh yeah,
Like 20
right.
volumes in his set.
Yeah, that I did look at someone. There's another Puritan. Yeah, those aren't always that helpful, but good for historical
Yes.
because they're so atomistic. But I
Yeah.
think, yeah, well, and Calvin did what 153
Yep.
sermons on Job. Gregory the Great did 5 volumes on Job. So there's some great sort of classic works out there. I have found, I mean, in the wisdom literature, my sort of 2 favorite go-tos, if they've written anything on it, and they've written on most of them, would be Daniel Estes and Trumper Longman. I don't agree with Longman on Ecclesiastes, but I've always found his knowledge of things, and I don't know if you know who Daniel Estes is, but I have such great respect for him. He's at Cedarville, and he's just a wonderful wisdom literature scholar, and so he's written on Job and classics. Francis Anderson in the 70s is still a great volume. Hartley is a sort of classic, still very helpful. I really liked, I think one of the things I really struggled with is like, how do I get to Christ? And Derek Thomas wrote a great book on Job. I'm forgetting what the name of it is, where he's just doing a masterful job of always getting to Christ and very practical. And then the Korean American scholar So, I think Seow, Sao or So. I've heard people pronounce it different ways, so I'm not sure how it's pronounced. But he did a 1 volume on Job 1 to 21, and the second one hasn't been out. It's been 10 years. I emailed him and said, "When's the second coming out?" And he never got back to me. I don't know him personally, but it's a masterful. It's one of the greatest commentaries I've ever seen. Like, because it's very technical, but it's just masterful in like the history of consequences. There's a little bit of, I've talked about artwork and things like this. He does all of that kind of work. And so where is this in literature? Where is this in art? In music, someone wrote something on this. So he's doing all the Bible technical stuff and the Hebrew, which Job is crazy tricky. And like, so he's like so helpful, like the most helpful ever in all of that stuff. And then he does these other things that are great for preaching. He's doing it more just for academic.
Yeah.
But I wish he would finish the whole thing, because it will just be a masterpiece to have both volumes on that. So those are the ones that come to mind. There's a lot of good stuff on Job. Christopher Ashe, a lot of helpful stuff for pastors.
Yeah, I found Ash
preaching the word.
Yeah, Ash was great. There are some in the Preach the Word series. There are some, like your Matthews in there. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Song of Solomon is yours in that series, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then you've got Ash on Job, and then Woodhouse has 1st and 2nd Samuel. Those are excellent books. Yes. That series often is not remembered for having some of those really heavy hitters, and so a really good set. Maybe that's a good question for you real quick, and then this will be the last one on the commentaries. If a young guy out there is like, I need to buy a set, I want to get one set to be able to put in my library, so I at least have a set covering, either the whole New Testament or the Bible, what would be the one set you would point him to? With the caveat of no set is perfect and there's better volumes individually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really happy with, I grew up with the Expositors, 12 volume set, and in the 84 or 82, and Crossways, done its 12 volume, which will all be complete, the ESV expository commentary. I'm really happy. I haven't looked at every commentary in there, but I'm really happy with that as a set. I think, maybe my advice is like, there's also other things. I'm actually working on Crossley's working on, with the Gospel Coalition, a concise commentary on the whole Bible that would be about 1,000,000 words, but one volume if possible. And I'm editing that with Ian Duguid and Andreas Kostenberger. And I'm hoping that will really be helpful, especially for so your question, kind of like, I don't have a lot of money.
Yep.
I need to buy something. It'd be great to cover every book of the Bible, so I can go, if I'm preaching there, I've got something.
Yep.
My other just advice is just to it really. I mean, you could kind of see behind me as I kind of see behind you. This is my commentary wall, and it's I collect little by little. So most of that was done while I was a pastor, and I typically had some sort of book allowance. And when I planted my own church, I made it a bigger book allowance. I highly recommend that, Joe. And I think so, but I invested in good commentaries. So, you can see these are all technical commentaries that are expensive. But they're worth having at least one technical. If you don't need to get but if I'm preaching on Jeremiah, which is a tricky book to preach on, and there's a lot of technical stuff you'll need to get your head around, a good introduction on like, what is this book all about? Like, I'd buy a really good technical commentary on Jeremiah, and then there's other things out there to help you. But so kind of that breadth of like a good, concise 1-volume or 2-volume commentary on the whole of the Bible can be really helpful. Using some online resources of like Matthew Henry or Calvin that you can find free online, or they're just great. There are some guys that have that timeless, J.C. Ryle, that timeless quality about their work, where every time you turn to them, boy, that's good, I could use that in my sermon. And so using online resources, and then building up your library with some good technical commentaries, or as you mentioned, like a John Woodhouse on 1st, 2nd Samuel, for 1st, 2nd Chronicles he's doing as well. Like, just that's, you're getting a lifetime of a brilliant scholar writing on that book in an accessible way. And that's gold.
That is great. Yeah. Well, you just get all of our people a lot of books to go out and to buy. So I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to be on Amazon.com. Get some stuff.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Doug. Very helpful. Would love just to wrap things up by talking not about writing anymore, but actually just about reading. We love to know what people are reading or what's been impactful in their lives. So we'd love to know for you, Doug, what have been some of the most impactful or most formative books for you in your faith and your walk with the Lord?
Yeah, great question. I always say, the most important book in my sort of spiritual journey was the Confessions, Augustine's Confessions. That was partly related. My testimony is a little bit similar to his testimony, converted late in life, sexual sin being part of the background, and then kind of going into pastoral ministry in the academy. So when I read the Confessions, I just thought, I've experienced that. I want to be like this guy. And so both like the first half of the book, just the story of grace in his life, and then the second half where he starts to do theology, and just kind of like that has been a picture of my life, of God saving me and then gifting me to write and help the church. Sorry, getting emotional. That's a good sign. That's how much I like the book. Calvin's Institutes. I had a class on one semester was Schleiermacher, one was Calvin, and Calvin was the first semester, and I just loved the Institutes. I just thought it was so helpful in like systematic theology. I wasn't Presbyterian. I liked the way this guy thinked. I like how pastoral he was. He was just clear. I was converted from Catholicism, so I liked all the anti-Catholic stuff too, because I felt like this is still kind of relevant, what he's fighting against. Edwards, I spent a year reading Edwards, and my favorite of his works was the History of the Work of Redemption. And why I loved that was it was my first introduction to biblical theology. And so it's kind of him going through the Bible, if I remember it all correctly, but certainly the Old Testament, and showing how it kind of points to Christ. And I remember reading about the Joseph story and how it connects to Christ, and going, wow, like I didn't know that was true. I didn't know how this all could work, how the Old Testament connects with the New Testament. And so through that work, it just opened, like, what else is out there? And so Graham Goldsworthy and Sidney Greidanus and people like this who are doing biblical theology in our time. And so it was kind of a natural connection from Edwards' classic work. And it's probably not one of the famous ones of Edwards, but to just, this is how you do biblical theology. And then I've always loved poetry and great writers. So I did my master's thesis on John Donne, the great metaphysical poet. So I keep coming back to his Holy Sonnets, and George Herbert, that same era. The Temple is his great work, and the Country Parson, a book on just being a pastor in a country church, which is what he was, is just a classic on sort of pastoral ministry, whether you're in a country or a little small church or something else. And then I'll have to throw in, like, I love G.K. Chesterton. Well, I haven't read him in a while, but The Everlasting Man is my favorite of his. And so I love how great a writer he is. I love how funny he is. And that's a book on Christ. It's just very Christ exalting. And so Chesterton's written a lot of different things, but that one is like, warms your heart to Christ. So those are a lot of classics there, but those classics have been, invaluable in my Christian walk and development.
That's great. Yeah, I echo. Everyone loves Orthodoxy, which is good book too. But Everlasting Man's my favorite. So big.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining with us, talking so much about commentaries in your process and books that have impacted you. We were really blessed by this, and hopefully all of our readers have enjoyed this conversation. We hope to have Doug on the program again to keep talking all things books and all things reading. So, Doug, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Chris.
That does it for this episode of Take Up and Read. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so that you can be a part of these discussions as they come out. Until next time, go enjoy a good book.